Hi everybody, it's Cash. Welcome back. Thank you very much for joining me. This is a bit of an impromptu video. I had no intention of making a video today, but somebody had suggested that I do transition pictures for a guy called Howard Carter. You've probably heard the name. He was the British Egyptologist who in 1922, along with other people, uncovered the tomb of the pharaoh Tutankhamun, who ruled Egypt around the year 1320 BC, I think. His transition pictures are also on this channel, if you want to go and find them. I'll put a link to them in the show notes below this video. But anyway, Howard Carter died in 1939 of Hodgkin's disease, amid a swirl of rumours that he and members of his team had been cursed when they entered the pharaoh's tomb. It was alleged that there was a clay tablet on the inside that read, "Death will slay with his wings whoever disturbs the peace of the pharaoh." Howard Carter said this was just nonsense, absolute tommy rot, he called it. But of course the rumours were fuelled by the fact that Lord Carnarvon, who was there when Carter entered the tomb and also who had funded the excavation, died about 6 weeks later. He had a mosquito bite, and while he was shaving, he took the top off the mosquito bite and became infected, and he died as a result. But Howard Carter maintained to the bitter end that there was nothing to this at all. So somebody said, will you please do his transition pictures to find out whether he was cursed and whether he died as a result. So I did the transition pictures. But the transition pictures gave rise to more questions about Howard Carter and his character. What kind of guy would override the possibility that there was a curse? So I found a piece of his handwriting, two pieces actually, one from when he was very young and one from when he was older. And I analysed those, and I'll tell you those because those are really interesting. And then finally, something came to light about an object called the necropolis seal. There were several sets of doors leading to the burial chamber, and one of the sets of doors had copper handles that were bound with strong rope and then sealed with a little picture of Anubis. This was a warning sign not to enter. And I thought, I wonder if I can go into the energy of those ropes, of that necropolis seal, and if anything will come that might relate to the curse. And it did. And the reason I'm doing this as a sort of impromptu video is because I actually felt something when I went into the energy of that seal. That's really why I'm doing this now. So what I thought I would do is I would tell you first of all the transition pictures for Howard Carter, then I'll give you the handwriting analysis of Howard Carter, and then I'll tell you what the pictures for that Pharaoh's curse revealed. So fascinating. I was so excited yesterday. But first of all, Howard Carter actually was a very sickly child in England. He was a very gifted painter, apparently. But he was a very sickly child, one of 11, I think. And his parents, as the children began to die, they lost maybe 3 of them, decided that Howard was going to survive. And they sent him away to the country, where he lived very close to a stately home, I think it was. And this stately home contained a whole bunch of Egyptian artifacts. And he became so interested in, passionate about, fascinated by these few artifacts in the stately home that the woman who owned it, Lady Amherst, I believe her name was, she said, "I'll tell you what, I will fund an expedition to Egypt for you to go and inspect things for yourself." And so he went. In fact, I think ultimately he became like an inspector of artifacts or tombs for the Egyptian government. But he was only in his teens. He was only like 17 years old. But it wasn't until 1922, having worked for years in the Valley of the Kings and so on, that he uncovered Tutankhamun's tomb. And then he died years later of Hodgkin's disease. So I went into the energy of Howard Carter. And when I did, it was a strange image. This was before he actually died. You know those machines in amusement arcades that have a claw in them? And you sort of operate levers, and you sort of pick up a fluffy toy and drop it down the little hole. He was being held aloft by one of those, and it moved along slowly, so he knew that he was dying. This was not a surprise to him. It was just a matter of the time and the place. He just gradually moved across. There was a hole, and when the claw and the hole were aligned, it released him. And he went down, and there was a period of blackness for a while. So there must have been two stages, a sort of gradual decline, the point of death, and then a few minutes, days of uncertainty. Because it was like waiting for an elevator. He was just standing there in the darkness of this tunnel, waiting and waiting and waiting. But the weird thing was that it wasn't a door, it didn't open. He sort of merged with it and went around it and was suddenly on the other side. There was no step forward. It was simply, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here, I'm going, I'm slipping away. And then I found myself on the other side of this black wall thing. That's all there was. And he felt so resigned to it. It was almost like, oh, well, that's what happens when you don't eat right or when you don't exercise. It was just that kind of resignation with a sigh. Very British, actually. It was, oh, well, that's what happens when you drink or you smoke or that kind of thing. You could just imagine him walking along with his head down in contemplation, his hands in his pockets, feeling really glum. And it brought him to that cave that I always see, that kind of meet and greet symbolic cave. It doesn't exist, but it is a way of setting a context for how the person feels, I suppose, or what their consciousness is going through in the final moments of their life. The interesting thing about Howard Carter's cave that differed from anybody else's was that it was rather like one of those old circus arenas from years ago. They'd have the tent, they'd have an arena, like a circle. And because animals went around the inside of the arena, there was something on the ground. It wasn't sand, it was some kind of earth they put down. And he had that soft earth that he walked across. And as he walked across it, he left footprints. And this felt so much like a man who realized he'd made a mark. He'd made an impression. He had done something that was significant enough for his memory to be honored in some way. That's what that felt like. But it was nothing to him, really. It was just like, oh, well, at least he's very much an oh, well guy. Oh, well, at least I did that. At least it wasn't wasted. And he just trotted on. It was so odd for a man who had accomplished something that would make him a figure in history. He was peculiarly down about it. Maybe that was his illness. It could be that, but as he walked along, he just saw the footsteps behind him and thought, yeah, well, you did your bit. That was it. And on he went. And there's always a tunnel that almost always a tunnel that these people go through. And maybe we all do this in a sort of symbolic sense. But instead of walking up the tunnel, he lay down. It wasn't necessarily reluctance to go. It was more like a resistance to going as fast as the process wanted him to go. He wanted to think. He wanted to analyze. He wanted to absorb in detail what was happening. Maybe he'd studied so much death in the Valley of the Kings when he was exploring that he couldn't in his own life simply let this go. It was an extension of what his research had brought him. And he wouldn't go. I couldn't make him go. I just watched him lying there in the tunnel saying, no, I need to absorb this. It's really, really important. Ultimately, you can't resist. You can try, but your ego is going to eventually be overridden by the forces of the universe, by grace. There is a current that you have to flow with. And in fact, he began to nudge forward incrementally to the point where dust or dirt began to gather by his head because he was being pulled along the metaphorical ground. And ultimately, he had no choice but to go, oh, well, I guess I'll give it a go. And he went the rest of the way. When he arrived at the light, he walked towards it, still analyzing, still thinking, still processing, but with no sense of magic or awe or wonder or anything that was religious or spiritual. It was just like, oh, okay, this is the next bit, this is what we do. And he went in backwards as if there was like a loft ladder. You know when people have a ladder down from their loft and they come down it facing the ladder? It was a bit like that, only there was nothing there. And in the end, he was forced to turn around and go into the light, and he disappeared. But there was no joy, there was no wonder, there was no spiritual enlightenment, there was nothing from Howard Carter. Not even that relieving of encumbrances that I see with so many people. And maybe he was too ill to have those, and those had been worn away as he steadily declined. Or maybe when he lay down and he was being pulled along, some of them went then, replaced by even more resignation about what was to come. But he didn't seem to have much resistance other than the resistance of curiosity, which would be left over from his ego self when he was in form. So those were Howard Carter's transition pictures. But it left me wondering about the guy. Why no awe? Why did he not feel anything? Why did I not feel anything? Even if it was like fear or concern or something. There was no sense of there being a curse unless it was kind of like, oh, well, that's what happens when you enter tombs and are cursed. So you can see these pictures left me wondering what Howard Carter was really like in life. Obviously, he succeeded as an Egyptologist and as a historical figure now. But why was there nothing more to him? Why was he such a two-dimensional figure in the transition pictures? And so I thought the answer to that will lie in his handwriting. I was very fortunate in that I found two pieces of handwriting. One from when he was, I think, 18 years old, and one from later in life. And I was able to contrast the two and see how he changed. So first of all, I'm going to let you have what Howard Carter was like when he was 18, taken from this piece of handwriting. And here you go. This explains it immediately. He had a voracious appetite for study and learning, with a broad, wide-eyed, and almost visionary perspective of what's possible. He was greedy almost, to the point where he would summarily override the views of others if he felt they were too timid and didn't agree with him. Vulnerable or oversensitive people might perceive him as a domineering monster, but that's only because of his passion for knowing, for finding out. He could be over-enthusiastic. His need to communicate was boundless. Ideas, theories, concepts, projections. This is at 18 years old. It's like he had a laser beam shooting out of his mind into yours, commanding the situation, directing activities, diligently pushing ahead. He was extremely cerebral, and this took control of him, leaving many deeper emotions in the dust once he had the bit between his teeth. And if there was some kind of contest or a point he had to prove, he'd go all out to win. He'd be a great team player, as long as he was leading the team, and everyone was operating with the same intention. If they weren't, he'd either yank them into line or push them aside in his rush to get to where he wanted to go. This was not a guy you wanted to mess with. There was much confusion around the heart, though. Much uncertainty and much inattention that wasn't entirely obvious to others. A smile, a laugh, a quip, or a joke disguised the fact that he was out of touch with how he felt on most things, because he preferred the realm of the mind, and presumably science, to introspection and dwelling on his problems. That was Howard Carter as a teenager. He was already an indomitable character. The other handwriting shows him having matured physically 10 years, and in terms of his personality, by about 40. Probably. He is showing signs of tremendous imagination, but also unstoppable determination, driven by some greater urges, perhaps instilled in him in youth, or alternatively as a reaction to how he was raised. He had little time for a large number of people. He was someone with numerous acquaintances and contacts, but very few close friends. This was about trust, first of all, but equally about not being interested in developing that kind of thing. Work was so much more fascinating to him. By this age, he had become more discerning, but no less competitive and driven, or domineering, come to that. The wild high-mindedness of his teenage years had given way by this point to a steadier, more consistent perspective. Although he didn't have a taste for confrontation, he was certainly very impatient and even angry to his core about certain frustrations or annoyances. Profound annoyance or even fury underscored some of his viewpoints and behaviors. But he buried them, ironically, he buried them where nobody would ever find them. Swallowed hurts, ignored personal pain, all in the cause of getting where he wanted to go and doing what he felt it was his duty to do. He had a sense of vision, like few others, actually, and commitment to the task like nobody else, plus a defiance of all emotional concerns when it came to pursuing his goal. That's sort of what the transition pictures felt like. Where was the emotion? Where was the reaction to what was going on? It was so ploddy, so glum, so matter-of-fact. At such times, he was less of a man and more of a robot, pre-programmed, coldly efficient, and unconcerned about how his message or his actions were received or perceived. He wanted what he wanted and wouldn't stop until he got it. If you wanted it as much as he did, then come along for the ride. If you didn't, please get out of the way and let him through. That was Howard Carter. So clearly this was not a man who was perturbed by anything so silly as a curse, which of course he denied existed. In fact, I think he and Lord Carnarvon and somebody else made an unauthorized entry into the tomb before the Egyptian authorities found out about it. And he explored and he went into the inner sanctum and so on. There were many, many chambers and sarcophagi and stuff in this place. In fact, I have been there. I'd forgotten that back in my early 30s, I think it was, I went to Tutankhamun's tomb. I have been inside. There's nothing there now because everything was removed after being catalogued by Howard Carter. It was removed to the Cairo Museum. And I've been to the Cairo Museum and I've seen it there, and it's absolutely fascinating. The issue remains, though, whether somebody of the current era, an archaeologist, has the right at a spiritual and soul level to violate the sacred tomb of somebody who died long ago. That's where the curse comes in. I mentioned the two copper handles on the ornate doors that, once opened, led to the tomb itself. They were tied together with very, very strong rope and given a seal with Anubis on it to stop people going any further. And I wondered whether I could get any kind of energy or pictures from that seal, the necropolis seal. And when I went into that, I just looked at that picture. The rope and the handles seemed to have no energy at all. It's like dead air. There was nothing there. But around them, there was energy. There was something discernible. It didn't amount to anything in my head, but it was around this dead air. Then I thought, okay, well, that's not terribly interesting, but I wonder if I could get energy from inside the tomb. Now, bear in mind, I've actually been there. So I've had this experience of what it's like. I don't need to use much of my imagination. But what if I went behind the doors to see if there was any energy in there? And this was just mind-blowing. In my head, I stood on the other side, so it was black. There's nothing there, but I could see the crack of the door with the light on the outside, glowing around that necropolis seal. And immediately, it was as if two colossal thumbs were pressing down, not on my skull, but on the inside of my skull. I felt pressure, not made up pressure, I mean definite pressure on my brain, both sides, inside my skull. And it didn't go away immediately, it just was there and stayed. And then I felt, what would it be? It was like there was, I don't want to use the word a force because that suggests something mystical, but it was like an energy pressing down on my shoulders, right? Like a weight. And I could feel myself buckling over. And I had a choice. Do I bend my knees or do I keep my knees straight? And I chose to bend my knees. Because this sense of weight, it wasn't an actual weight, but it was a sense of weight, was pushing me down. There was pressure here. What I thought this was, and I could be wrong about this, but what I thought this pressure was conscience. A sense of I shouldn't be here. I am aware that I have crossed a line, intruded upon another soul's territory. That's what this felt like to me. So the curse was a mortal thing, a kind of made up thing by humans. But if you believe in them, then you take them on board and they become very, very potent. And the thing about Howard Carter, just from his handwriting, was that he was not going to respond to matters of conscience like that. He was a cerebral guy, a scientific guy. He had a mission, he had an intention, and he was going to go ahead with that no matter what. He put his conscious self at odds with his unconscious connection to the universe that says, do not disturb another soul's territory. And I think that's what this pressure was. I am not Howard Carter. When I stood in that energy, I felt like I should not be there. He would simply have overridden that. Maybe Lord Carnarvon the same. But the curse is not an outward thing inflicted on you and able to impact you. The curse, it struck me from the pictures, is all about your inner conflict with your conscience. You still know, if you decide to rob a bank, that robbing a bank is wrong. You may tell yourself, oh no, I need the money. No. It's a karmic strike against you. You've drunk your own poison by robbing a bank. Because you know, at an inner level, you shouldn't be doing it. And that's what this felt like. Maybe Howard Carter, when he went through his transition, was really saying, oh well, that's what you get when you ignore your conscience. I doubt it, actually, given his character, but maybe that's what caused him to be so glum and isolated and ill. He had cursed himself. And that's what I got when I looked at Howard Carter. Thanks a lot, guys. Bye-bye.